Rain crawled down the window like time refusing to move, and Elena Carter said, "If I open this, I can't go back." Parcel was small, heavy with the weight of years she tried to forget. A county seal glared up like a final warning. She slit the tape and found a phone, cracked and tagged as evidence, and her breath faltered. A voicemail waited, time-stamped on the night her sister died, and Elena said, "Please don't be what I think." Nora's voice trembled through the room, naming Victor Hale and a deal that buried the truth. The words turned knives and found every soft place she hid. Elena said, "You knew, and you let me drown." And the rain answered with a harder drum. The city dimmed as if complicit. She pressed the phone to her heart and felt terror, fury, and a small, stubborn filament of resolve refusing to snap. Morning dragged gray over the city as Elena walked into the clinic that smelled of eucalyptus and rain-damp coats, and she said, "I heard her voice." Grace Patel watched her carefully, not crowding the silence. Elena told her about the name in the memo, and the way the truth felt like broken glass. Grace said, "The body stores what the mouth can't speak," and the room settled. Elena wanted absolution and also punishment, both burning at once. She said, "If I pull this thread, I lose what little is holding me." Grace nodded and asked what she feared more, the unraveling or the weight. Elena stared at the window where leaves shook off the storm and said, "I need to know who let her die." The diner clinked with cups and low radios while Sam Walker slid coffee across the booth, and Elena said, "It was Nora, and it was him." Sam's gaze held steady, an anchor in a storm. He said, "You made it here, which means you're already stronger than last night." She wanted to laugh, but the sound stuck, so she traced a ring of water on the table. Sam said, "Say what you need. I'll carry the rest," and his voice softened. Elena told him about the memo and the deals, and shame lit her cheeks. He said, "Shame is a liar with a good memory." Traffic hissed outside and Elena felt something unclench. She said, "I am going to find him." The parking garage breathed damp concrete when a black sedan rolled from the shadows, and Elena said, "I don't have time for ghosts." Victor Hale stepped into the weak light, immaculate and cold. He said, "Old cases should stay closed, Miss Carter." Her pulse hammered, but she held his gaze. She said, "You took her voice and sold it." Victor smiled like a man in a mirror he trusted. He said, "Careless words and expensive." A metal gate rattled somewhere above, and the world felt too bare. Elena said, "Send a bill," and fear twisted into anger that finally had a target. By evening, the community center piano room smelled of polish and memory, and Jonah Reed glanced up as Elena slipped in. He said, "You look like you haven't slept in a year." She wanted to deny it, but the piano had already found the minor key in her chest. Elena said, "If I keep moving, maybe the ground won't crack." Jonah played a soft progression and said, "Then let it crack where it must." She told him about the voicemail and the meeting in the garage. He paused, hands hovering, and said, "Truth asks for a price, not a tip." Elena felt the note linger and for a breath believed she could pay it. The storage unit smelled like metal and dust as Elena slid the door up and the hinge cried. Boxes wore Nora's handwriting like a bruise she kept touching. Elena said, "You kept everything I threw away." A winter draft licked her wrists. She opened a box of ticket stubs and the map to a road trip they never took. Elena said, "I left you the wheel, and you still waited for me." The quiet answered with a hollow cold. She found a cuff bracelet she had given back in anger, tagged by date. Elena said, "I was so loud when I should have listened." A fluorescent hum shivered. She pressed the bracelet to her palm and felt a weight that was not metal. Grace waited until Elena's shoulders settled before speaking, and the clock softened its tick. Grace said, "Name one thing your body believes is safe." Elena stared at her knuckles and said, "Warm mugs and songs I pretend not to know." Grace nodded like a small bell. She guided Elena's breath with a hand over her own heart. Elena said, "If I forgive myself, what anchors me to her?" Grace said, "Love anchors without the chain." The words landed without shattering. Elena tasted relief and fear, tangled like thread. Grace said, "You can grieve the story and still write another page." Wind feathered the lake until it looked like a restless thought, and Elena cupped the phone. She replayed the voicemail and watched gulls argue with the sky. Elena said, "I keep expecting you to step from the wind." The message cracked on Victor's name. She felt the old reflex to run, then stayed. Elena said, "I will not let fear be your last echo." A jogger passed, and the world continued without permission. She scrolled to a photo of Nora and the smile that made rooms forgive themselves. Elena said, "I remember the light your laugh made." The water kept its secrets, but her spine found height. Jonah's cord landed like a question that wanted to help, not pry. He said, "Tell me the part you only whisper." Elena closed her eyes and said, "I fear the quiet because it lets grief speak." He nodded, letting silence be a soft chair. Elena said, "I could have called her back. And I did not." Jonah said, "Guilt is a metronome. It keeps time, not truth." The thought widened the room. He played a progression that rose and refused to collapse. Elena said, "If I move, maybe the ache becomes a path." Jonah said, "Then let's walk it in time and tune." The laundromat hummed like a tired hive while clothes circled their small weather. Sam said, "I told you I'd carry what I can." Elena washed a red shirt, pressed the glass and said, "It still feels heavier than both of us." He shrugged with a soft grin. Sam said, "My brother slipped last fall, and I kept breathing anyway." The admission steadied the room. Elena said, "You're allowed to keep that quiet and safe." He said, "So are you, until you are ready to make it loud." Coins clinked as a dryer finished. Elena said, "Then we start with one honest load at a time." The county archives smelled of toner and marble dust as Elena signed the log and slid into a row of gray metal drawers that hummed like bees. She said, "Show me what you buried." The clerk glanced up, wary, then returned with a thin redacted file. Elena said, "So light for something so heavy." Black bars marched across the pages like a parade of silence. Paula Green said, "Public record, but names are protected." Elena traced a date that matched the night. The phone recorded Nora's fear. She said, "Protection for whom?" A stapled note carried Victor's initials like a bruise under makeup. Paula said, "You didn't hear that here." Elena folded the copy and felt the quiet tilt, as if truth had weight and the floor remembered it. Wind scooped gravel across the rooftop as Sam set a thermos between them like a truce they both needed. He said, "You're shaking and pretending it's just cold." Elena said, "There's a memo with Victor's initials, and I missed it for years." He watched the skyline breathe and said, "You asked me to stand down when you left the case, and I did." The words stung because they were true. Elena said, "I left because I was afraid of what it would take." Sam said, "Fear is honest, it just should not be captain." Sirens braided through the air like a warning they couldn't see. Elena said, "I need you in this even if it gets ugly." He nodded, and the city felt like a team of horses ready to run. Grace dimmed the lamp until the room felt like a held breath, and she said, "Your nervous system is asking for a slower song." Elena said, "My body only knows the drum of alarm." Grace guided her to name 5 colors in the room, and the ceiling knotted. Elena said, "I kept an award I didn't deserve, and Nora saw me pretend." Grace said, "Shame confuses accountability with identity." The sentence opened a small door. Elena said, "If I say what I did, I lose the version of me that survived." Grace said, "Then let her retire and make room for the one who heals." The clock ticked without accusation, and Elena felt her hands warming around her own breath. They parked by the river warehouse where sodium lamps made the water look like melted brass, and Jonah killed the engine. He said, "You sure this isn't a job for a badge?" Elena said, "Badges closed the door last time." A security light blinked as if thinking it over. Jonah said, "Then we count doors and keep breathing." She smiled without softness and said, You make fear sound like choreography. A delivery truck coughed awake, and a figure hauled a crate stamped with a law firm logo. Elena knew too well. She said, he launders the truth through paper. Jonah said, then we filmed the wash. The river clinked against the pilings like coins. Elena knew the apartment had been entered before she found the metronome on her table, ticking with cruel cheer. She said, cute. A note leaned against it with block letters that did not try to hide. It read like a shrug from a man who expected obedience. Victor said, let the dead rest, without being in the room. She felt heat swarm her scalp, and then drain to her heels. Elena said, I will not let your rhythm own mine. She filmed the scene, called Sam, and opened every closet because courage needs chores. The metronome kept time while her resolve chose a different song, and got louder. The copy station groaned as Paula slid a ledger across, and Elena felt the chill of fluorescent honesty. Paula said, access logs like you asked. A column showed Sam's name beside the sealed case date. Elena said, he pulled it without me. Her throat tasted like pennies and winter. Paula said, might be routine, might be favor. The page trembled, though her hand did not. Elena said, he promised to move only when I did. The stapled corner scraped like a match. Paula said, truth arrives with mud on its shoes. Elena folded the sheet and let the thought bruise. She said, if he lied for me, we break. If he lied to me, we burn. The alley behind O'Rourke's glittered with bottle glass as Sam stepped out, and the exhaust painted their breath. He said, I pulled the file to see if Victor moved first. Elena said, you moved without me. He looked past her at the street that never learned to whisper. Sam said, I called him once to warn him off you. The word called landed like a thrown wrench. Elena said, you gave him my rhythm. He said, I tried to buy you time. Sirens smeared the corner in red. Elena said, time without trust is a leash. He flinched but did not run. She said, do not choose for me again. Grace set 2 glasses of water down and waited like a harbor. Elena said, I am drowning on land. Grace said, name the wave. Elena said, betrayal that sounds like help. The room carried the word and did not break. Grace said, pain asks to be believed. Elena wanted comfort and a door out. She said, your breathing tricks feel like pillows over my face. Grace absorbed the strike and exhaled once. She said, then let's stand, not lie down. Elena's eyes burned with the unfairness of being seen. Grace said, precise pain bleeds less. The clock moved, slow and patient. Elena said, I still choose the fight. Backstage hummed with cable snakes and old posters, while Jonah wiped rosin from his fingers. He said, you came, so you are not done. Elena said, your song almost talked me out of anger. He smiled without rescue. Jonah said, anger can be a railing if you stop swinging it. She looked at the door, marked exit like it had opinions. Elena said, I push people when I need hands. He stepped close, but not touching. Jonah said, I am here until you say, leave. She hated that kindness more than threats. Elena said, do not follow me tonight. He nodded and let her grief pass first. Victor's fundraiser glowed like polite armor, and Elena stepped into the lobby where empathy wore tuxedo. Victor said, you have a gift for entrances. She said, you have a gift for graves with clean lawns. He laughed like a man checking his watch. Victor said, the narrative loves a pen that flatters. She held up Nora's memo copy and watched him fail to blink. Elena said, I am done flattering your ghosts. He leaned in, voice silk with wire. Victor said, you were warned once by a sister who trusted you. The cut landed where she kept air. Elena said, I am here now. His smile thinned. The room clapped for a donor, and her pulse refused to bow. Paula called Elena back to the records room where the copier hummed like a secret breathing. And she said, There's an auto backup of your file, Elena said. The voicemail. Paula nodded and slid over a disk. The second half unfurled like a blade. Nora said, Victor promised to keep your name off the chain error. The words struck and kept echoing. Nora said, I took the deal so it dies with me if it breaks. Elena gripped the table because the floor wanted her knees. Paula said, audit shows a later access by a city attorney's office badge. Elena said, not Victor? Paula said, not him. The fluorescent light felt like noon inside a storm. Elena said, she carried my guilt and I carried my anger. The copier stopped and the silence was exact. Victor met Elena in a quiet side corridor that smelled like lemon and old cases, and he said, you finally listened to the whole thing. She said, you hid my mistake to protect your office. He did not deny the bruise. Victor said, I protected a witness and your future badly. She felt the insult and the care inside the same sentence. He said, the leak came from a city attorney badge, not mine. Elena said, you still buried the truth. Victor's eyes thinned like doors to a vault. He said, I chose the smaller harm and it grew teeth. She said, Nora paid for my mercy. He nodded once, grave and unclean. Victor said, help me expose the leak, and I sign my name to it. The rooftop felt colder than weather as Sam set a folder down like a confession he was ready to share. He said, I didn't leak it. Elena said, you accessed it alone. He nodded and did not flinch. Sam said, to trace who else moved after me. He slid photos from a security cam near the warehouse. A woman in a navy suit keyed a side door. Sam said, Maya Harlow, city attorney's office. Elena watched the timestamp kiss the night Nora died. Sam said, I was wrong to call Victor, but I am not your enemy. Wind shoved the thermos, and it rattled like a verdict rolling. Elena said, then stand with me when it gets public. He said, say when. Grace listened without blinking as Elena poured the new shape of guilt onto the rug between them. Elena said, I made the chain error, and she made the sacrifice. Grace said two truths, not one sentence. Elena wanted punishment that felt like justice. Grace said, accountability is a door, not a cell. The line loosened a knot under her ribs. Elena said, if I go public, I lose what is left of my career. Grace said, you gain the self who can sleep. The clock clicked once like a metronome that finally answered to her hand. Elena said, then I choose the door. Grace's eyes shone with relief that was not soft. She said, write it and sign your name big. They chose the community center over a press room because the truth needed wood floors and faces, not a podium of mirrors. Jonah said, I'll start the room breathing. Elena said, play soft so the words can land. Sam stood to her right like a promise he would test in public. Elena read the statement that named her error and Nora's choice. She said, I was protected when the truth needed air. Murmurs moved like weather across chairs. Elena said, a city attorney badge accessed the sealed file the night my sister died. She set copies down for anyone to take. Jonah let the last cord hang. Elena said, I am ready for the inquiry. The oversight hearing room smelled like coffee and nerves as Elena signed the witness sheet and steadied her breath. Sam said, I am here, and his voice landed like a hand on a rail. Jonah sat behind her and said, count 4, breathe on 2. Grace said, choose truth over performance, and the clock stopped feeling like a judge. Elena faced the dais and said, I made the chain error, and I reported it late. A murmur broke, and then healed itself. She said, my sister left a message naming a promise and a price. The chair asked if she understood career consequences. Elena said, I understand the cost of sleep. A court reporter's keys stitched the moment into something that would not forget. Maya Harlow's heels announced her before her oath did, and Elena felt the room lean toward the center of the storm. Maya said, I accessed the file on authorization from my division. The chair asked for the order, and silence trimmed the air. Elena said, "Your badge opened a sealed door the night a witness died." Maya flicked her glance like a blade and said, "Chain errors create urgency." Victor stepped forward from the gallery and said, "Not that night." Paper slid across the table like a verdict in transit. Elena said, "The access log and camera timestamp align." Maya said, "Convenient coincidences multiply under pressure." Victor adjusted the mic like a man pinning a ribbon to his own ruin, and he said, "I buried a narrative to protect an office." The room exhaled, as if it had been waiting to see a spine. Victor said, "Miss Carter warned me. I chose the smaller harm, and it metastasized." Elena felt anger and grief. "Stop wrestling, and stand shoulder to shoulder." She said, "Sign your name to the memo and the admission." He nodded once, tired and exact. Maya said, "You cannot launder guilt through theater." Victor said, "Then we name it in ink." The chair asked for the exhibits. A pen clicked, and the sound felt like a hinge turning toward daylight. When the chair asked for a final statement, Elena felt the room shrink to the size of her breath. She said, "I left a mistake alive because I was afraid to lose the survivor I had built." Grace's eyes held her steady, without a rope. Elena said, "Nora chose to shield me, and I am done letting that be the last chapter." She named the times she avoided calls, and the night she froze at her desk. She said, "I accept sanction, and I accept change." Sam's shoulders, lowered like a burden, had heard its name. Elena said, "Let this record teach better doors." The chair nodded, and the gavel sounded like a door frame taking weight. The courthouse steps held the day's last light, as cameras clicked like locusts that had learned manners. Jonah said, "You stood in the fire, and kept your shape." Elena said, "I lost the version that hid." Reporters shouted for blood or balm, and she said, "Read the statement." Victor paused on the landing and said, "I will face my board." Maya brushed past counsel and said, "This is not finished." Elena felt the old drum try to start, and then quiet. She said, "Neither am I." Grace touched her shoulder and said, "Choose rest before the next mile." Sam said, "I'll drive," and the street opened without demanding a price. Morning lifted itself carefully over the blinds, and Elena let the light find the floor. The inquiry letter waited on the table like a held breath. She said, "Read me without mercy." The words named sanction, training, and a probation that did not erase. Relief and grief took turns in her chest. Elena said, "I asked for consequence, not a sentence." Coffee steamed like a small promise. She pressed her palm to the letter and felt the paper steady her. Elena said, "Nora, I am finally using my own name right." The room did not argue. The city exhaled outside, and the day did not demand a disguise. The park wore last night's frost like lace as Sam arrived with 2 coffees and a look that did not pretend. He said, "I was wrong to choose for you." Elena let the bench hold their shared weight. She said, "You tried to save me like I was fragile glass." He winced and nodded because honesty can be polite and still sting. Sam said, "Tell me the job and the boundary." She said, "Stand beside me, never in front." A dog barked itself joyful and reminded the air to move. Sam said, "Deal?" "And I meant forever when I said friend." Elena said, "Then we practice forever today." City Hall echoed like a cathedral that remembered every promise, and Victor stood beneath the seal with a statement that did not duck. He said, "I resign, and I accept review." Elena watched his hands, not his reputation. He said, "I mistook quiet for care and turned harm into policy." Reporters scribbled as if speed could change gravity. Elena said, "Put the reforms in writing." He nodded, weary and strangely lighter. Victor said, "I will sponsor what corrects me." The atrium gathered their words and refused to beautify them. Elena said, "Then begin with access logs and witness funds." He signed, and the pen sounded like a lock choosing open. The rehearsal room smelled of pine and rosin, and Jonah rolled a chord that felt like a door on good hinges. He said, "Play the left hand, I'll catch the right." Elena smiled because fear had less room when the measure fit. She said, "I do not know the bridge." He said, "We will arrive by not rushing it." The notes mapped a truth that needed breath more than speed. Elena said, "I want this, and I want space to stay myself." Jonah nodded with a softness that did not shrink. He said, "Yes to both." The cadence settled like a hand over a racing heart. Elena said, "Then let's keep time, not cages." Dusk turned the lake steel blue as Elena stood with the cuff bracelet cooling her palm. Wind folded the waves into small, patient shoulders. She said, "I will carry you as light, not weight." A printed photo of Nora waited in her coat, and memory warmed the pocket. Elena said, "I forgive the version of me who froze." A gull stitched the horizon and left the sky whole. She set the bracelet in a small cedar box and tied it shut with twine. Elena said, "I choose doors that open." The water received the reflection of a woman who did not need to hide. The air held the last note, and then it was quiet.